I used to believe that love could erase class, money, and background, that if two people truly cared for each other, nothing else mattered. I was wrong. When I married Daniel, everyone said I was lucky. He was kind, well-spoken, and came from a family that appeared modest but respectable. They lived simply, dressed simply, and spoke humbly about life. I admired that about them. I came from money, but I never liked showing it. My parents had raised me to value people, not status. So when I married Daniel, I chose a quiet wedding, no luxury, no headlines, no display of wealth. I thought simplicity would keep us safe. The first few months of marriage were peaceful. We rented a small apartment near his workplace. I cooked, cleaned, and adjusted myself to a lifestyle far simpler than the one I had grown up in. I never complained. I wanted to belong. Daniel often told me how grateful he was, how proud he felt to have a wife who didn't care about money. Those words made me happy. But slowly, things began to change. It started with small comments. "Must be nice growing up without worrying about bills. You wouldn't understand real struggle. At least you always have a backup." I brushed them off at first. I thought he was just insecure, trying to process our different backgrounds. Then his family started visiting more often. His mother would walk around our apartment, touching the furniture, inspecting the kitchen, opening cabinets without asking. She never said anything directly, but her silence felt heavy. One afternoon, while I was serving tea, she laughed softly and said, "People who grow up rich never really learn how to manage a home properly." Daniel didn't defend me. That was the first time I felt something shift inside my chest. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself that marriage required patience, that love meant endurance. But patience slowly turned into humiliation. They began making decisions without asking me: what groceries to buy, what furniture to replace, even how I dressed. Daniel started controlling expenses, despite knowing I paid half the rent. He questioned every purchase, every choice, every habit. "You don't know the value of money," he would say. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that the money he looked down on was earned through years of sacrifice by my parents. But I stayed silent. Then one evening, I overheard something that made my hands go cold. I was standing outside the bedroom when I heard his mother whisper, "She doesn't even realize how lucky she is. If it weren't for us, she'd be nothing without her money." Daniel laughed. That laugh stayed with me all night. It was then I realized something terrifying. They didn't love me despite my wealth. They resented me because of it. And they believed I was weak enough to never fight back. That night, lying awake beside my husband, I made a quiet decision. If they thought I was just a rich girl pretending to be poor, I would let them keep believing it. For now. The next few weeks passed with an uncomfortable calm. On the surface, everything looked normal. Daniel went to work, I managed the house. His family visited often, staying longer each time, as if the apartment already belonged to them. But inside me, something had changed. I started noticing things I had ignored before. How Daniel would suddenly lower his voice whenever he spoke about money on the phone. How his mother watched me closely whenever I paid for something. How his sister casually asked questions about my parents' assets, pretending it was just curiosity. I answered vaguely, I smiled, I played the role they expected. The simple wife, the rich girl who didn't understand struggle. One afternoon, Daniel sat across from me at the dining table, his tone unusually serious. "We need to talk about finances," he said. I nodded calmly. He explained how his family was going through a tough time, how his mother's house needed repairs, how his sister wanted to start a small business. He spoke as if these were shared responsibilities now. "You don't mind helping, right?" he added casually. "After all, you've always had more than enough." There it was. Not a request, an expectation. I asked him gently, "How much?" He named a number that made my fingers tighten around the glass of water. It wasn't small. Still, I didn't react. I didn't argue. I simply said I'd think about it. That night, his mother stayed over. I could hear her whispering in the living room, her voice sharp and confident. "She'll agree. These rich girls always do. They're too soft." Daniel murmured something in agreement. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart steady, my mind clear. They thought silence meant weakness. They had no idea that silence was my shield. Over the next few days, I began preparing quietly. I reviewed documents I hadn't touched since the wedding. I checked accounts Daniel didn't know existed. I contacted people I trusted without revealing too much. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning truth. One evening, Daniel came home smiling. "Good news," he said. "I told my mom you'd help. She's already excited." I looked at him and smiled back. "Of course," I said softly. "Family should support each other." His relief was immediate. His gratitude felt shallow. That night, as he slept peacefully beside me, I realized something painfully clear. They didn't see me as a partner. They saw me as a resource, and soon they would learn the difference. The days that followed were strangely revealing. Once Daniel believed I had agreed to help, his behavior shifted. He became lighter, more careless. The careful tone he once used with me disappeared, replaced by a quiet sense of ownership. He stopped asking. He started informing. "My sister found a place for her business," he said one evening. "Mom is meeting a contractor tomorrow. We'll need to transfer the money soon." We. That word echoed in my mind. I nodded each time, calm on the outside, observant on the inside. I noticed how quickly plans were being made with money that wasn't theirs yet, how confidently they spent something they hadn't earned. His mother began treating me differently too. She spoke to me with a strange mix of superiority and entitlement, as if she had finally confirmed what she always believed, that I was useful, not equal. One afternoon, while we were alone in the kitchen, she said, "You should be grateful, you know. Not every rich girl gets accepted into a humble family like ours." I looked at her and smiled politely. Inside, something hardened. That evening, I received a call from my father. He asked gently how married life was treating me. I almost told him everything. Almost. But instead, I said I was fine. After hanging up, I sat alone for a long time, reflecting on how easily I had tried to shrink myself to fit into their world, how I had mistaken humility for self-erasure. That night, Daniel showed me a document on his phone, a loan agreement he had already drafted. "All you need to do is sign," he said casually. "It's just temporary." I read it carefully. My name was there. My responsibility, my risk, their benefit. I handed the phone back without signing. "I need time," I said. His expression changed for just a second, irritation flashing across his face before he masked it with a smile. "Don't overthink it," he replied. "This is what families do." I watched him walk away, and in that moment I understood the truth with painful clarity. They weren't waiting for my consent. They were waiting for my submission. And I knew then that whatever happened next would decide everything. Not just our marriage, but who I would become after it. The shift became impossible to ignore after that night. Daniel stopped pretending. His patience grew thin, his tone sharper. When I hesitated about the loan, his words carried an edge I had never heard before. "You're making this complicated for no reason," he said. "You know my family is depending on you." Depending on me. Not loving me, not respecting me, just depending. I began to see how carefully everything had been planned. The visits, the conversations, the gradual pressure. None of it was accidental. They had been testing how far they could go, and I had let them believe they were winning. A few days later, his mother invited me to lunch alone. She chose a modest cafe, the kind that pretended to be simple, but watched every customer carefully. She spoke softly, smiling as she stirred her tea. "You're a good girl," she said, "but you need to learn something. In marriage, a woman must support her husband's family first. That's respect." I looked at her hands, steady, confident, and titled. "And if I don't?" I asked calmly. Her smile faded just enough to reveal irritation. "Then you'll prove what we always suspected, that rich girls only pretend to be kind." There it was, the final confirmation. On my way home, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. That evening, I opened my laptop and began organizing everything, not just financial documents, but memories, messages, promises Daniel had made before marriage, every lie neatly archived, every contradiction preserved. I wasn't preparing to fight, I was preparing to reveal. When Daniel came home, I greeted him warmly. I told him I was ready to sign. His relief was instant. "You see," he said, "I knew you'd understand." I smiled. What he didn't know was that I had already understood everything, and understanding, I had learned, was far more dangerous than resistance. Understanding changed everything. From that moment on, I moved carefully, deliberately, as if walking on thin ice that only I could see. I acted agreeable, supportive, almost grateful. Daniel noticed the change and relaxed completely. He thought the storm had passed. The loan papers were printed. The conversations became cheerful again. His family started making plans openly, renovations, business ideas, even future investments, all based on money that still wasn't legally theirs. One evening, as I sat alone reviewing the final documents, a thought crossed my mind. Not bitter, not angry, just honest. Hello, viewers. Let me pause here for a moment. If you're listening to this story right now, tell me, have you ever felt taken for granted by someone you trusted? And where are you listening from today? Your city or country? I'd really love to know. That quiet reflection gave me strength. The next day, Daniel drove me to meet a lawyer, his lawyer. He didn't even ask if I wanted my own. He assumed obedience the same way he assumed access to my finances. The lawyer explained everything quickly, confidently, skipping over the risks as if they didn't matter. I nodded, I smiled, and then I asked one simple question. What happens if the business fails? The room went silent. Daniel shot me a warning look. The lawyer cleared his throat and gave a careful answer, one that made it very clear who would bear the consequences. I thanked him politely. On the way home, Daniel's patience cracked. "Why would you embarrass me like that?" he snapped. "Do you want them to think you don't trust us?" I looked out the window and said nothing. Trust. That word had lost all meaning. That night, I signed the documents. Or at least that's what they believed. Because what they didn't realize was that I had already made changes of my own. Quiet ones, legal ones, irreversible ones. The illusion of victory settled comfortably around them. They had no idea the ground beneath them had already shifted. The days after the signing felt strangely quiet. Daniel was lighter than I had seen him in months. He laughed more, slept better, spoke with confidence. His family stopped pretending altogether. They talked openly about renovations, about expanding the business, about how things finally worked out. I listened. I observed. I said very little. Money began moving, at least on paper. Daniel proudly showed me screenshots, transactions he believed proved everything was now settled. He didn't notice what wasn't there. He didn't question why certain confirmations never reached his phone. One evening, his sister came over, carrying fabric samples and notebooks, already planning the opening of her shop. "You should come to the launch," she said casually. "It'll be nice for you to see where your money went." I smiled softly. "I'm sure it will," I replied. That night, I received a message from my lawyer. Just one line. "Everything is exactly as you intended." I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling neither joy nor fear, only calm. Daniel lay beside me, scrolling through his phone, already living in a future he believed was guaranteed. He spoke about moving to a better neighborhood someday, about how we would finally live comfortably. We. I wondered when he would realize how fragile that word had become. A week later, the first crack appeared. His sister's landlord backed out. The contractor delayed. A bank request was suddenly rejected. Daniel brushed it off at first. "It's just minor delays," he said, but his voice wasn't as confident anymore. That evening, his mother called, once, twice, then 3 times. Her tone had changed, sharp, suspicious. Daniel began pacing the living room, frustration building with each unanswered question. "They're saying the funds aren't fully cleared. That doesn't make sense." I watched him quietly, because it made perfect sense to me. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. The tension grew quickly after that. What had started as small delays turned into unanswered calls and confusing explanations. Daniel spent hours on the phone, his voice rising, his confidence fading with every conversation. "They're making excuses," he said one night, rubbing his temples. "Banks, contractors, everyone is suddenly incompetent." I brought him a glass of water and said nothing. His mother came over the next day, her face tight with concern. She walked straight past me into the living room, speaking rapidly, demanding answers. For the first time since I had met her, her certainty wavered. "You said the money was secured," she snapped at Daniel. "It is," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "It has to be." She turned to me, her eyes sharp, searching my face for something she couldn't name. "You signed everything, didn't you?" she asked. I met her gaze calmly. "Yes," I said. "I signed what was right." That answer unsettled her. The room filled with uncomfortable silence. I could almost hear the weight of their expectations pressing down, the realization that something wasn't adding up. That evening, Daniel confronted me in private. "Did you do something?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual but failing. I looked at him, studying the man I had once believed would stand beside me, not above me. "I did exactly what was necessary," I replied. He frowned. "That's not an answer." I smiled faintly. Neither was trust. For the first time, fear crossed his face. Not anger, not frustration, but fear. The fear of losing control. He walked away without another word, and as I watched him retreat, I knew the truth had finally begun to surface. They were no longer certain, and uncertainty was the beginning of the end. Uncertainty changed the atmosphere in the house. The laughter was gone. The casual confidence had vanished. Every conversation felt tense, unfinished, as if everyone was afraid to say the wrong thing and uncover something they weren't ready to face. Daniel barely slept. He stayed up late, checking emails, making calls, whispering angrily into his phone. When he looked at me now, it wasn't with expectation, it was with suspicion. His mother stopped giving orders. Instead, she watched, closely, as if trying to measure how much power I actually had. One afternoon, Daniel finally sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly together. "Just tell me the truth," he said quietly. "Is the money really there?" I held his gaze. The money was never the problem. The way it was treated was. He leaned back slowly, as if the weight of my words had physically pushed him away. That same evening, his sister called in tears. The shop opening had been canceled. The landlord wanted proof of funds. The suppliers refused to proceed without confirmation. Everything they had announced so proudly was now collapsing in silence. Daniel slammed his phone onto the table. "This is your fault," he said angrily. "You did this on purpose." I stood up calmly. "No," I replied. "I protected myself." He stared at me, stunned. For the first time since our marriage, I saw him clearly, not as a husband, not as a partner, but as someone who had mistaken access for authority. That night, he didn't come to bed. I sat alone in the quiet apartment, listening to the city outside, realizing something deeply unsettling and deeply freeing at the same time. I was no longer afraid of losing them. They were afraid of losing me. And that fear was long overdue.
The fear didn't disappear the next morning. It settled in quietly, like a shadow that refused to leave. Daniel barely spoke to me. When he did, his words were careful, measured, as if every sentence might expose something he wasn't ready to admit. His mother stopped visiting. His sister stopped calling. The house felt emptier, but heavier. That afternoon, Daniel finally broke the silence. "We need to talk," he said, sitting across from me, his shoulders tense. "Everything is falling apart." I nodded slowly. "I know," I replied. He hesitated, then asked the question he had been avoiding for days. "What did you really sign?" I took a deep breath, not because I was afraid, but because this moment deserved honesty. I signed documents that protected my assets, documents that made sure no one could use my money without my consent. His face drained of color. "You tricked us," he whispered. I shook my head gently. "No, I listened, I watched, and I learned." He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "You let us believe. I let you believe what you wanted to believe, the same way you let me believe I was your partner." That word again, partner. He stopped pacing. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and realized something painful. Intent didn't erase impact. "Maybe," I said softly, "but you didn't stop it either." Silence filled the room once more. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that a marriage was unraveling, not through shouting or violence, but through truth, and I knew, deep inside, that the final choice was coming. Not his, mine.